Welcome to the Nick Halaris Show. This is the place where we explore big ideas with people having a big impact on our world. I'm your host, Nick Halaris, serial entrepreneur, author, early morning riser, and seeker of truth and wisdom. Join me as we explore the journeys and discoveries of fascinating people who are literally unlocking the secrets to creating a life of both success and fulfillment. Each episode will arm you with insights, ideas, and practical perspectives on what it takes not only to be financially and personally successful, but also how to start having authentic impact on the world around you. Hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. Today, we are welcoming Demetri Kofinas, who's the creator and the host of Hidden Forces, which is one of the most popular and thoughtful podcasts in the world today. Demetri, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
There's so many places that we could start this interview because your podcast covers such like a broad array of intellectual ground. But I thought maybe the best place would be to just kind of introduce Hidden Forces. What is it? Where did it come from? How did you come up with the idea? Kind of, you can answer sort of any of those things, but I'd love to just understand the story behind Hidden Forces because it's such an incredible program.
Thank you. Well, I used to have a radio show. My start in media started with a blog. Or on the content side, I had worked on the technology side of media before that in television and in video games. I started a blog that I had in the early days right in the beginning of Obama's Democratic primary run. And that coincided with the 2008 financial crisis. So I covered that, and that eventually led to a radio show that I got on 91.5 in New York, and then eventually a television show. And I stopped that all in 2013. And eventually, in the interim, I eventually developed the idea for Hidden Forces in the summer of 2016, when I was doing a lot of reading for a book I was working on that started me down the path of re-engaging with my interest in science and technology. I had also been going to meetups in New York City around that stuff, around AI, blockchain, IoT, and kind of do-it-yourself stuff, and some hackathons. And so I got back interested in science and tech. And then eventually that drew me back into economics, finance, and markets, and politics and geopolitics, which were stuff that I was interested in and covered back on my old radio program. And the concept of Hidden Forces, which kind of emerged from that, was it pulled in my intellectual curiosity, my desire to sort of engage objectively with the world and try to remove my subjective biases and understand more clearly what is actually going on in reality, and to deal with these hidden forces. And what are the hidden forces? They're basically the powerful forces that impact our lives, and giving people frameworks to understand what those things are. So a good example, and something I used recently to explain this to people, is the stuff that we've done around the US dollar. We've done a ton of episodes on the US dollar. What is it? What is the US dollar? How does it work? What gives it its value, etc.? And why is that important? It's important for two reasons. In other words, giving people a framework about the US dollar and frameworks in general is because these are subjects that populate the popular news feeds of people. They're constantly being bombarded with stories about these particular things, which they're told are important. And so having a good frameworks helps you understand what to focus on and what not to focus on. And two, it's because these things are sometimes, in the case of the US dollar, certainly are important, and therefore understanding them is important to your portfolio. And in this particular case, and also in this particular case, to your understanding of your role as a citizen of the country and the power of projection of the United States, etc. So Hidden Forces was from the very beginning about dealing with these complex phenomena, these forces that impact our lives, that structure the world around us, and helping provide people with maps, frameworks, models, schemas that they can use to understand these forces and that they can update on a regular basis in a world where legacy educations, university educations are insufficient, increasingly insufficient for helping us make sense of a world that is constantly changing.
And for those who haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. I've been binging on it. And Demetri you cover such incredible ground because there are so many interesting things and they're all interrelated, these forces that you're discussing. So question, did the book ever come together? You said this could have sort of started with a book. Did it come together?
Well, it technically started with an article I wrote for the Atlantic's Quartz magazine, which was about my brain tumor and my surgery and radiation and that whole experience that I went through. And I was approached to write a book, and I signed an agreement to write a book. I mean, I decided not to do it in the end, but I was working on it. And besides the work that I was doing on my own biography related to that experience, I also wanted to introduce into it a substantive conversation about neuroscience and what we know about how memory works. So that was where it began. I started doing a lot of research into that. And that eventually led to other avenues of science that I had, let's say, been interested in exploring more of in the past, but I aborted because I got, pulled into other parts of life. So, and then I started, again, to my point about science, tech, and I just started what basically happened was in the process of researching to write the book, I became so obsessed with all the things that I still wanted to read and learn about that I had kind of left on the cutting room floor, that eventually led to the creation of Hidden Forces and the abandonment of the book, which ultimately I think I wanted to write it, I think, but also I wasn't as passionate about writing a book about my experience as I was about having a show again. I really missed having a program.
Okay, that's interesting. What happened with the brain tumor? I mean, obviously it's a positive story, but do you mind sharing?
Yeah, no, I had been diagnosed with a brain tumor, what's known as a craniopharyngioma. It's a benign tumor in the sense that it's not malignant, but it's not benign in the sense that it's asymptomatic. It was very it can have really bad symptoms, the most common of which are hormonal. And in fact, craniopharyngiomas typically manifest in children. And I think from what I understand, it's sort of universally agreed that these tumors arise in utero. So it's something that I would have had with me my whole life, but it just happened to present symptomatically later in my life. So usually they're hormonal. In my case, the real issues were memory related. I developed dementia, which was not something I was told that I was going to get, but I was diagnosed in 2008, almost basically incidentally. And then in 2000 so this was the summer of 2008, and then I developed clear symptoms that impacted me in the summer of 2009. It's been so long I forgot. Summer of 2009 I was diagnosed, and in the winter of the very beginning of 2013 is when I clearly developed symptoms, though it's possible that I had symptoms earlier, I didn't know it. Yeah, I had interrogated amnesia. I've talked about this, literally couldn't remember. You and I would have a conversation, we would hang up a call, 5 minutes later you called me, I totally don't remember. Didn't remember my birthday, didn't remember the president, didn't remember where I was going. Had all sorts of conversations where people thought I was on drugs. It was a whole experience. I recommend if people are interested in that, they should they should read the my article for Quartz Magazine where I kind of laid it out in a pretty detailed way. But that was an experience that changed me in many ways, and one of the ways in which it changed me before I even developed symptoms when I had been diagnosed was to gain some perspective around risk and what really was a risky behavior and what wasn't. And it made me much more willing to take risks or things that I previously thought were risky, and to be more fearless in the way that I approached my life. And so I credit that diagnosis to where I am today in that way and in many other ways too.
That must have been a scary experience. So, be a young man and then lose touch with your mind like that, man.
It's very scary. I mean, I'm talking about it now in a way that feels very divorced from it because it's been so long. Primarily, it's because it's been so long. I mean, I'm sure I could, if I really sat here and kind of let myself sink into what it felt like then, I could probably bring myself back. And actually, I've had to deal recently with the consequences of that. I have what is probably radiation necrosis from the radiation that I did. I did 6 weeks of daily stereotactic radiotherapy, and I did an MRI recently in March, and it looks like I have significant soft tissue loss in white matter, presumably from the radiation. But I'm in the process of getting the paperwork done to begin hyperbaric treatments, which are oxygenation therapies where for someone like me, they're particularly intense. So it would involve being 2 hours inside of an acrylic tube where they bring you artificially down to lower barometric pressures, which allows them to pump large amounts of oxygen into your tissues. And that, according to the literature and people that I've spoken that have actually done this on patients, that have worked on patients doing this can cause significant regrowth of including brain tissue. It's for people that are my age, it's very rare to see this kind of issue. It's people my age typically where this has been used has been in treating traumatic brain injury, like athletes and stuff like that. But even with people that have had other issues related to tissue necrosis, they've seen huge differences. I'm also excited potentially because I lost my sense of smell during COVID. It hasn't come back. I have very limited smell. It could help with that. It could also help with exercise. I could try to be like a pro athlete while I'm doing this, kind of exercising in the morning, going to the tube in the afternoon. So what I would say about this, because there's a lot that I could say, and as I said, I'm not in that place emotionally where I'm kind of sitting into it and just feeling it and feeling that sense of vulnerability and fear. When you go through experiences like this, they can either change you, or you can not let them change you. And I think in all, what not allowing them to change you means is that you're basically, you see that, I guess that's a way of saying that you don't confront your fears. Like if you don't let something change you like this, you're not really confronting your fears and dealing honestly with it. And if it changes you, it can really change you for the better. And it can make you, one of the things it can do is it can make you more courageous. And you can learn how to deal, courageously with the things that scare you. And in this case, the fear of morbidity or death.
Yeah, man, that's such a good perspective. And I agree. I feel like almost no matter what, you're going to have some kind of crisis moment at some point. It's sort of like what Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung and these people were talking about. And the question is, as a person, is what are you going to do with it? And it manifests completely differently for you, and depending on what your story is, or maybe what your cosmic karma is, who knows? But coming out of it, you can change your life, and it sounds like you did. And thank you for sharing that. And I hope these hyperbaric treatments are fruitful.
I want to do some episodes. When I'm doing it, my goal is that when I start these therapies, to do some episodes, not just on hyperbaric treatment, but also to just do a whole series of episodes on longevity science and medicine and all that stuff, the kind of science of living better. There's some people out there, I'm thinking specifically of Peter Attia, who has a dedicated podcast to this, and there's a lot of interest in it. And it's something that I've wanted to cover in the past, but I've been interested in a lot of other things. But this seems like an appropriate moment to do it, where I can also tell people about my own experience, what experiences I'm having cognitively, what are the changes that I'm feeling. So that'll be a cool way to kind of make it relevant to the work that I'm doing too.
I think for sure. Yeah, I think that would be fascinating. I mean, there's all kinds of manifestations of what you just described. Like there's even people spending like millions of dollars a year trying to like reverse the aging process and all this techno-utopian type stuff, which, maybe that's another episode. I'm not sure. I think that's the right application of these things, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole today.
Well, what's happened is that there are, the segment of people that you're describing are largely kind of boomers or wealthy, older X generation people who have made a lot of money, are also alphas, type A personalities, very high performing people who are used to exercising a lot of control over their lives and getting what they want. And at this age that they're at, what is there left to want that they haven't gotten? They can pretty much get anything. What they want to do is, if not live forever, certainly live a longer, healthier life. And of course, there's nothing wrong with wanting those things. I think that's great. Actually, there's nothing wrong with that. I think where it becomes problematic is where people become obsessive about it and sort of live in death denial around, and kind of become, I think, disconnected from the natural process of life. And that's a whole other conversation, which is kind of to what extent these technologies can facilitate that, and advancements in science can facilitate that, and to what extent that's even something that we can manage as a society, where one group of people has these sort of magical elixirs or the ability to select for particular traits in their children that give them an advantage and not everyone else. That's a whole nother societal problem.
And this topic is related to actually a lot of things that you've talked about on your podcast and some of the big issues, some of these hidden forces. And I was thinking about it the other day for some reason. It's like, it's an extreme manifestation of this tale of two cities dynamic that we live in, where, look, if you become a billionaire or something at age 35, let's say you have some tech exit. Yeah, I get it. You want to live forever, because guess what? Like, living in this world as a billionaire is qualitatively pretty darn good. Like, it's the best that you could possibly imagine in human history. And so I sort of understand why people are going in that direction. But by focusing on that, you ignore the other side of the truth, which is that the vast majority of human beings are not experiencing life like that. And they're thinking about it differently as a result, because they're working hard. They're barely surviving in some cases. And
yeah, for sure.
Well, cool. Well, I want to jump into the meat of this by, bringing up a topic that we sort of touched on. You sort of touched on already in a couple of your answers, which is this idea of the generational evolution and conflict and the fourth turning. And I know you've interviewed a lot of people on your show about the concept of the fourth turning, but I'm curious, like, what's your take on it? Like, do you think the fourth turning is something that is sort of objectively real? And are we in it? Or what do you think?
The Neil Howe's theory around the fourth turning is that there are five. Was it five? No, sorry, there are four. Right, there are four different generational archetypes. I can't remember them now. It's been a while since I did the episode. But the awakening generation, I think, is a generation that would have been the boomers. Then there is another generation, which was the Gen Xers. Then the Millennials are I forget the name that he has for those. And then the generation following that, I'm sorry, I messed it up. I can't remember now which ones are which. So in any case, what do I think of Neil Howe's overall thesis? Look, let's put aside whether or not it's sort of empirically defensible that there is this procession of the seasons, of the four different seasons of the cycula, which is how he describes it, and that these are the forces that, in the particular way that he puts them forward, drive the sort of most important historical events of the world. I do think that it's useful to think about generational archetypes as having a consequential force of history on their own. I just don't know if it's exactly the way that Neil Howe describes it. But I certainly do think that generations do matter.
Yeah, I sort of am on the same page. I'm kind of ambivalent. Like when you read the fourth turning or you listen to Neil Howe sort of articulate it, it sounds great. It actually sounds like a framework that makes a lot of sense. And I do think that there's something that's true about there's something objectively true about the difference between generations. But as I was taking a step back, I was thinking like, well, it's something easy to say, but there's two things. Number one is he only has like a few hundred years of data, maybe a little bit more. And number two, it's also a framework that doesn't really help you make better decisions necessarily. Like even if you could identify that you're in a fourth turning, is that really going to impact, like, for example, how you do your asset allocation today in this moment?
I think it could. Look, I mean, where I would say, what I think, and I think I told Neil this, was that I feel like one of the things that I really like about the framework is that it gives each generation a roadmap and a sense, a sort of a sense of their own identity and purpose. Because I do think that one of the challenges that we have today is that people feel increasingly lost around purpose, younger generations, and what their purpose is. And so I think there's value there. But, to be honest, I don't remember when I did that episode. It wasn't that long ago. The fact that I can't quite remember much details around it just is interesting. Clearly didn't make that much of an impression on me now that we're like sitting here and talking about it. But at the same time, I do remember really digging a lot of what he had to say and the sort of overall vibes around the thesis and the framework. So, yeah.
Yeah, like when I read the book, it was several years ago now. I ended up like creating like an Excel matrix. I think it's actually hard to keep the framework together because it's like cycles within cycles, and he has all this phraseology. So I created like this note for myself of an Excel table showing it. I should have printed it up and shared it. But you mentioned something in your answer too about this purpose thing, and since you mentioned it, why don't we just go there right now? Like, I agree with you completely. I think that there's a massive sort of bear market in people feeling like they have purpose. What do you think are some of the causes of that?
Well, one, it's always difficult to diagnose this because it's my perception of what I think. I guess the one question is: do people feel or have less purpose today than they have in previous periods? I mean, I wonder. I don't know, because I'm a very sort of mission-driven person. I'm very passionate, and when I have felt purposeless or rudderless, it's been a really difficult thing for me. I've not been okay with that, and I've really tried to find a direction in my life. To the extent that it's happening more today, I think that it may just have to do with the nature of the economy that we have, and the fact that so many jobs have been, that, let's say, people were able to do at lower education levels have been automated away, that maybe the jobs that many of the jobs that exist feel so mundane and repetitive. That's not necessarily new. It may also be because people's sense of what qualifies as a meaningful line of work or occupation has narrowed, because they see all these successful people on social media and they think if they're not doing that, they're really not doing anything useful, so that kind of the more mundane jobs feel even less useful today than they would have. That I don't know, but that's the best. I haven't really given it. I haven't thought about that. I probably should think about it more.
Yeah, but I think you're touching on some very good points. And in one of your recent episodes, I think I forget the woman's name, but she was fascinating, and she's doing a lot of work on sort of the studying these emergent,
Tara Isabel Burton.
Yeah, the religion of the self and all this stuff. And you had a conversation where you talked about sort of the epidemic of narcissism and stuff. And I think it's related to what you just said about the impact that these social media technologies have had, where we already are inclined to be selfish beings, and this technology overlay is essentially like putting that on, amplifying that, and everyone is essentially self-focused. That's one of my working hypotheses, is that with the absence of like some kind of unifying spiritual moral code and these technologies coming in, people basically become incredibly self-oriented, and maybe too much so.
I definitely think people are more narcissistic and more self-obsessed and superficially minded today than they were in the past. It's difficult. It's one of those things that's difficult to quantify, but I think one way in which you can sort of validate it is you look at who we elevate. Who are the people that we, sort of elevate as heroes? They're very narcissistic, much more than in the past. Like our past heroes were, even when I think about sports, when I think about like professional athletes and who were some of the big athletes that I followed when I was younger, and who are the ones that are today sort of the biggest athletes, the nature of their sense of branding and their sense of being a commercial product and their sense of importance and everything else, I think has grown substantially. And that kind of probably relates to it. Look at also the politicians. I mean, some conversation I was having recently as well, which is like, if you look at some of the big populist candidates of today, and then you look at some of the big populist candidates of the past, because I single in on populism because it's the populist voices are the loudest, and it's easy to conflate populism with narcissism if you're just looking at it in terms of being loud, some of these big heuristics. But the difference is that like these past populists, whether it was FDR or whether it was Ross Perot or whether it was William Jennings Bryan, not to put Perot on the same level of Bryan, but the point is, if you look at these people, they were much more mission-oriented in their populism. Yes, they had groups that they demonized. They were oriented towards a vision for the country. You look at the populists that we have now, whether they are populists in political populists or whether they are, people in the commercial space, in crypto or in, Elon Musk is a great example who kind of runs the gamut of various technologies that he dips his toe into. And he has a very strong showman vibe. But if you look at Musk, his populism is really narcissistic. Same thing with Trump, very narcissistic populism. So I think that's where you can find evidence for what I think is a larger societal phenomenon, and our leaders just reflect back to us what we desire or how we see the world.
Hey guys, this is Nick. I wanted to take a quick break from the episode to share some exciting news. In addition to the podcast, I want to make you aware of some additional content we're putting out. And best of all, it's 100% free. Our Profit Plus newsletter consists of weekly insights about what it takes to find meaning in the pursuit of modern success. This is the place where we explore big ideas at the intersection of markets, business, politics, and life, as we seek to empower our readers to have an authentic impact on the world. If you're serious about finding fulfillment amid success, then definitely check out these additional insights. Just go to subscribe.nickhalaris.com. Again, that's subscribe.nickhalaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. It's true, I think, of the populist figures outside of this country too. It's like this cult of personality kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, I wasn't alive when these other people were there, but it did seem like
who, Ross Perot?
No, like FDR or somebody like that, like a mission-driven populist, let's say, who had a vision for the country, like, hey, we're going to get through this, we're going to band together. Where Trump is like, what's good for me? Kind of that's what you feel when you engage with his rhetoric.
Yeah. Or just confusing, confusing. Yeah. Anyway, I agree. It's confusing.
Yeah, for sure. So coming back to this generational conflict, one of the things that I've been thinking about is that the culture wars are also a manifestation of something related to generations. And I have this working thesis that essentially there's this big financial conflict between the boomers and the millennials and the younger generation related to the promises made by the pension in the pensions and social security and all these things. And these are they're basically like nuclear standoffs, right? Like you're looking, if you're on the boomer side or the other side, like, and so as a result of this nuclear standoff, we have the culture wars where the generations are fighting politically about stuff that's basically inconsequential instead of dealing with what they should deal with, which is this nuclear bomb of like, hey, we just made a bunch of promises to the boomer generation that are literally we're not going to be able to keep them unless we really want to hurt the millennials and younger generations. The thesis is that the culture wars that we're experiencing come out of that nuclear standoff rather than someplace else.
And the nuclear standoff is the unfunded liabilities?
Yeah, the fact that we've made these promises to the boomers. Boomers are hanging on to power for dear life across the board, extracting as much as they can from the system. And the younger generation is getting hurt.
I think there's an element of, there's something there that accurately captures a dynamic, but I think that the universalization of it is problematic in the sense that, like, I don't think the primary dynamic that's driving outcomes is this battle, the intergenerational battle between the boomers who are just holding on to power and the millennials or Zoomers who want to take power. I think that's a feature. You can see it in Congress. In fact, there was recently an article in The Atlantic that I read this morning about Mitt Romney. It's an excerpt by, I think it was written by his biographer, and it's an excerpt from her biography of him, which looks like it's really good. And he describes what the Senate and Congress are like, the Senate in particular. And yes, what's the term? Gerontocracy. So I think but I think that gets too much play, the whole boomer millennial thing. So I think that's my answer to that, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's one that's like, it may be like the fourth turning, like it's impossible to empirically verify whether it's true, but it's just something that I've noticed not only on the national level, but even like with local politics and stuff. Like the people that are in power are making decisions that are bad for the younger generations consistently.
I think that's probably always been true. That I would reframe it and say, rather than like they're making decisions that are bad for the younger generation, I think what I would say is that the older generations are making decisions that benefit them, even if they primarily benefit them, even if they come at the expense of younger generations. I think that probably was always true. I think maybe what's to one degree or another always true. I think what's new now is some of that stuff that we were talking about before, which is that like a lot of these boomers are now, they might be 70 years old, but they feel like they're 50. And a lot of them are, like they're 50. They're, I was down in Naples. I don't know if you got that reference, but I was down in Naples last year, and my friend of mine was making a joke that like Naples is where 70-year-olds come to be 50 again. With all these hormone therapies and stuff, like older people are kind of living like they're younger. And so they want to hold on to power more. There's less of a sense of the sort of natural procession of life's phases. So again, I think that's true, but I don't think that's the major. I don't think that's as big a story as like the millennials and Zoomers have made it out to be, because I think a lot of people have just wanted to demonize boomers, maybe in part to justify their own generational cohort's lack of success and sort of arrival onto the scene as a force of nature onto themselves.
Speaking of Romney, I think I saw something flash on the news. He's not running. He announced he's not going to run for re-election, right? Mm-hmm. I didn't read anything behind it.
I didn't vote for Romney in 2012. I wish I did.
Yeah.
In retrospect, I wish I had voted for Mitt Romney. I thought he was so. I didn't vote for anybody in 2012. I had voted for Obama in 2008, and then I didn't vote in 2012. I remember that whole speech where he was like, "I got binders full of women and stuff," and he was so uptight and so unrelatable to, I think, young people. But in retrospect, when I look at how successful he's been as a person in the world, his success. It was also 2012 was also the worst year, or the second worst year to be running as a private equity guy. But the guy, when I look at, he looks better and better with time. And he was a serious person, and he has integrity. Sure, he might be a condescending asshole to some people. I bet he can be, probably. But yeah, I wish we had him instead of Obama in 2012, or him instead of Trump in 2016, or him today. I would vote for him in a heartbeat if he ran for president. A heartbeat. I wouldn't even think about it. I'd be like, finally, someone I can vote for.
Yeah, the Republican Party needs somebody like him to come in and kind of get rid of this Trump energy. And who knows, maybe his secret plan is he's going to do that, but we'll have to see.
What do you think? That's interesting. So what do you think the Trump energy is? How would you describe that?
The Trump energy is this sort of divisive, us against them mentality that's focused on playing to the people's fears and of their sort of lack of economic mobility, and using that to gain power with no real coherent vision, but just to be in power and to talk trash and to talk about immigrants in a bad way. And it's like an unproductive kind of like hatred. That's what it feels like. Now, I know it's not.
So by Trump energy, you specifically mean the energy of Trump, not necessarily the energy that Trump is harnessing of the base of people that support him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's pretty fair. I think a lot of people that have those that are feeding off of that sort of vibe that Trump is putting out and have aligned themselves with that frequency, because a lot of Republicans who may not like Trump have nonetheless are publicly very supportive of him. And that goes back to what I said. There was a recent article in The Atlantic about Mitt Romney's time in the Senate. He captures that, and that article expresses that as well.
I'll have to check that out. Well, I want to switch gears now because there's another interesting idea that's come out of I think it's your idea, but I heard it on your own podcast as well as podcasts where people were interviewing you, which is the idea of financial nihilism. And my question is, what is it? And in light of what's happened in, for example, like the crypto blow up and the venture capital quasi blow up, like what do you think about the thesis? So maybe let's start with the definition, and then we can answer that second question after.
Oh, man, I had a formal definition of financial nihilism. It's been a long time since I was interviewed about it.
I did write this down. It's essentially like, it's a great thesis because I think there's components of it which are still true today. It was definitely true when you came up with it and during the COVID era. But the idea is that investors are treating the instruments of investment as pure objects of speculation.
Right. It's a philosophy that It's a philosophy that sees the objects of speculation as being inherently worthless, something along those lines. It treats the objects of speculation as though they were inherently worthless. And yeah, that was something that I increasingly began to find the words to articulate in 2020, I think, or I can't, maybe it was 2020 or 2019, where I was beginning to feel that, and and it was crypto that made me really attuned to it. Crypto and Tesla were the two sort of, Tesla as a stock and crypto as a category, where you saw a lot of that, where you saw people coalescing. And what were the common things? They were not just a desire to get rich and a gambling mentality, but also a desire for community and the ability to find community in sort of the worship of a particular stock or a particular crypto. And really, there was, in my opinion, little regard for the the sort of underlying asset that was being traded back and forth. And we saw that also with GameStop. That was another good example where like people just coalesced around a particular narrative and were clearly getting a bunch of things out of being in communion together and betting on the direction of a particular stock or crypto. But where, again, what seemed to be utterly lacking was dealing with the underlying substance. And by the way, this also intersected with frameworks around the Federal Reserve, money printer go burr. Again, to talk about the 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath, people, I think especially younger generations, lost faith in the system. They lost faith in notions of underlying value and the ability to make positive investment decisions based on your understanding of fundamentals. So that's kind of the milieu in which I came up with my concept of financial nihilism. And I think it was a pretty accurate depiction of the world that we lived in up until the last year or two, where interest rates started moving up and where there was actually a substantive value to your cash, and that there was a benchmark, a real benchmark to evaluate the profitability of any enterprise, because now we had positive real interest rates. Now, whether or not that kind of nihilism is over is something that I don't know. Time will tell, because it's still early. Like we were only a couple of years into this experiment. We'll see how enduring it is. How long will people be able to feel like they can get a real return on their cash by not taking any risk? By establishing a kind of risk-free rate benchmark that is above zero. So that's sort of how I would answer that question.
I feel like it seems like it's still a feature of our markets, because even though there was major damage done in crypto, and it's maybe even still ongoing, and venture got hurt, and then the big tech got hurt, it all came back except for crypto, let's say. And we've had this AI boom where, again, some of these things appear to be divorced from reality. Like, I'm no like stock analyst, but the stuff around NVIDIA feels like Tesla in the COVID era. And maybe NVIDIA has a better path to profitability or to growth than Tesla does. But
I do think people have become bigger degenerates. I mean, that's a term, obviously, it's used a lot in crypto in a kind of sort of in almost like a loving way. I think people, there's a gambling mentality, man, that's taken over. How much of that is driven by the fact that asset values got so high and people felt like they were, quote, not going to make it, and so they had to YOLO into every opportunity to make money, because the only way they could really make money was to go for it, because incremental gains were no longer really going to move the needle? How much of it was that, and how much of it is just a kind of degeneracy that sort of independently driven, or which initially fed off of the changing underlying distribution of wealth and income and opportunity to make money, but ultimately divorced itself and just became a self-fulfilling prophecy in and of itself?
Yeah, I feel like there is a huge component of this gambler mentality in the system still. And part of me sort of is empathetic to it, because we live in this, like we talked about earlier, we live in this like insider outsider world where, man, that if you can, you want to make it to the other side. This is what in my view, what like the Sam Bankman-Fried thing is about, is like we developed a culture where the belief was all you got to do is just make it to the other side and be rich, and then everything will be okay. And obviously it looks like that group of young people took that to a crazy extreme and engaged in probably criminal activity. But that ethos was what was going on. And it's not completely irrational, because it's like, well, you do want to get rich. You do want to get out on the other side, because living in this country is great if you do.
Sure. Yeah.
Are you still interested in the crypto space? Are you involved in it? What's your take on what's going on now?
No, I'm not really involved in it anymore. What's the best sort of way? What's the most accurate way of sort of capturing? I'm trying to think about capturing my feelings on crypto. It became the level of speculation in the space, the challenges of investing in it, of devoting time. So look, I can't devote time to something unless I can make a show around it. Okay. So that's also important to note. It's actually very important to note, and I'll explain why. But like we talked about it with like hyperbaric, right? I was going to try to make a show out of it because I'm going to be spending so much time in a hyperbaric tube that I might as well try to do something with that experience. If I'm going to put in the time to really understand a space like crypto in order to make successful investments, which is something that I did early on, I have to be able to make content around it. And it's what I discovered in the context of doing that was that it put me in a difficult position, because I feel responsible for introducing audience members to projects, because they may end up investing in them, and what if they don't work out, or what if they're, whatever, or it could be a scam. Like look what people that promoted FTX, and I don't even take sponsors, right? But like people that had FTX as a sponsor, or who had Sam Bankman-Fried on and worshipped him, or whatever. Now, there's a very lucrative business. Lots of people in crypto and crypto podcasting do this. So that and that was a challenge for me, because I tried to, I don't know how much detail I want to go into this, but it was a project recently that I featured because I thought the technology was super compelling. And I was like, this could be a really great opportunity to have another shot at the apple here of getting in early on something that I think has a compelling series of use cases and whose founder, whose chief tech person I really liked. And I grew disenchanted with other members of the organization, so much so that I didn't want to really have anything to do with them anymore. So that was the last sort of experience I had getting really into some aspect of the industry or some part of the industry and then feeling like, it just wasn't going to work. But there's some really smart people that I have on. For example, I've had the framework guys on. I know them really well. I know their organization really well and other people there. They're really smart. There's clearly a future in this industry. There are opportunities. And so I'm just not someone that feels really like I can responsibly spend time covering that because of the way that the money funnel works and the spigot works,
That makes total sense.
But I've benefited from. Look, I mean, I've made good money from investing in projects in that space. So it was. I don't regret it. I couldn't. I guess continue to participate and play a role in the way that I had originally envisioned because I felt it was too challenging and compromising potentially.
And that makes total sense for someone in your shoes who has, such a large loyal following. And it is dangerous. I mean, Bitcoin, it was my single best investment. I bought it in 2015 or something, but I recently sold it all. And I had sold it over time as well, mostly because I started to come to this conclusion that there's a shot that Bitcoin is worth zero. And I feel like it's like a non-trivial percentage probability. There's just been so much damage. And like, I understand sort of the intellectual theory behind Bitcoin, but ultimately Bitcoin has a shady origin that nobody really knows about. And that sort of dark cloud over it, I think people is eventually going to sort of overwhelm the positives if technology doesn't just come and overwhelm it with some other project. So that was my thought. I might be right, might be wrong, but it's been good, but I'm glad I'm kind of done with it.
I think there are a lot of problems with blockchain in general, but Bitcoin specifically, but I think that blockchain technology, specifically Ethereum, has done really well because of its network effects. But I think that, again, it's not the ideal way to run a distributed ledger, but Bitcoin is so much more than just blockchain. It is, it's a lot of things, but I also am not a huge fan of it's not that it's more like I have a problem with a lot of the Bitcoin grifters who are sort of like the kind of Moses characters but grift on their audiences and all that bullshit around not going to make it. And, like that whole period. And I'll never forget like how gross and exhausting it was to listen to that whole industry of people who were just, like there are a lot of the representatives or self-declared sort of messengers or gurus were just like, oh my God, such fucking lowlives. So I'm just glad that's over for now.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe we'll have to deal with them again, but that was exhausting.
Yeah, it was exhausting for that reason. And like people, if they make a bunch of money, they tend to think they're smart because our society sort of rewards that. Like the number one way to become a guru.
You definitely didn't need to be smart to make money in crypto and anything in crypto, including Bitcoin. You didn't need to be smart. You just need to be. You could have been a drug dealer on Silk Road and made a fortune because you lost the keys to your wallet because you were so fucked up on whatever you were smoking. And then you wake up 3 years later and you're a gazillionaire. So that happened to people,
Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This episode of the Nick Halaris Show is brought to you by Metros Capital. If you're an investor looking for direct access to real estate investments, then we'd love to talk with you. Investment opportunities at Metros Capital balance financial returns and community impact. To learn more, contact us at metros.nickhalaris.com. Again, that's metros.nickhalaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. I want to switch gears now and talk about, this is kind of a big topic, but we can try to at least do some damage on it with our remaining time because it's an area in my view of supreme importance. And I haven't done like a distribution analysis on your show, but I feel like your show is largely about this. And it's the relationship between politics, markets, and business. And one of the things that I think, if you sort of pay attention to traditional media, for example, if you only consume traditional media, all of these things are reported on sort of in isolation. But in truth, they're like incredibly interrelated. And For example, like you just had a gentleman on your program talking about this idea of fiscal dominance and the way in which the government could pass along, and the different ways in which the governments could pass along inflation to the citizenry. And I thought that was fascinating. But how did you get interested in it? And well, why don't we start with that? How did you get interested in these connections? You sort of talked about it earlier, but
Man, from the very beginning, I mean, episode 2 of the show, we talked about the origins of economic theory and its the early economists weren't even called economists. They didn't even call it wasn't even called economics. It was called political economy. So I've been interested in the origins of economic theory and the nature of an economy since the earliest days. And I think that I think the reason that I spend more time on it in this way is because we're in this period where a lot of our assumptions are being shaken because there are a lot of changes happening politically and geopolitically. And so because of that, it's much more useful and relevant to think about the economy in this more reductive way, as opposed to, using fancy theories which aren't as necessarily accurate.
yeah, I agree. I feel like all of the big problems that are manifesting, like take, for example, one that's top of mind in states like New York and California, housing affordability. We talk about this stuff, business people report on it, whatnot, but that is so tied to the politics of development that you literally can't really understand why we have housing affordability crisis unless you understand the politics, and then also the role that the Fed has played over at least over the last 15 years, probably longer, in creating the conditions for asset prices to just keep going up. At the same time, the politicians were like not being very successful at getting stuff built in their communities, and we have this perfect storm. And it's understanding these connections that is the key to finding a solution.
Sure, maybe. I mean, I don't know. I think it's very complicated. Housing affordability or the affordability of life in general, let's just say that, is about, I think, much more than just Fed policy. Fed policy has played a role, but I think that we've exaggerated the role that the Fed has played and the extent to which the Fed is. And I think what's more accurate is that the Fed has been following in the footsteps of the society in general, and the sort of the prioritization of capital over labor that's been going on for like at least 40 years.
Yeah, and say that's an interesting idea. Say more about that. Like, how in what way has the society sort of been leading the Fed down that road?
Well, I mean, I think the Fed is populated by people. Those people come out of the same culture that the rest of us come out of. And for the last 40 years or so, there's been understandably, the country they had gotten fed up with unions, they'd gotten fed up with price controls, they'd gotten fed up with an overarching, overly involved bureaucracy that felt not only oppressive in a sense, but also incompetent. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Reagan's revolution came after we lost helicopters in the desert heading to Iran after the oil price spikes, the stagflation, the budget crisis that happened under the Ford administration in New York, where New York almost went bankrupt. They had to get bailed out. So, like, I think we were at a turning point, and that was a period of time that empowered capital. And then the fall of the Soviet Union, I think, gave further credibility to the claims of capitalism and capitalists as being better systems. That was incorporated into what we think of as the neoliberal economic order, where capital was freed geographically, and we saw things like the Asian financial crisis because of that freedom and its ability to move anywhere and be rewarded. And we saw a kind of adoption of a framework that I think ascribed to capital a kind of omniscience that I think was always just unsubstantiated was always not grounded in sort of measured, sober thinking. Like, I don't think, in other words, that, first of all, let's put aside the completely, I would say, just false arguments that there is a natural state of economic affairs, that somehow like libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism are somehow closer to what is the natural world, the natural expression of an economy. Economies are situated within political systems. Politics and the legal structures create the laws that govern the behavior of agents in an economy. But I think that this idea that the invisible hand, so to speak, will sort of like just almost magically, not magically, but people perceive it to be magic almost, allocate capital most efficiently, and this will ultimately lead to a better system, was always bullshit, because it was situated within the power structure that politics creates. And to the extent that that allocation leads to inequities that feel unfair, that's going to create political repercussions. And I think that's where we are today. We're at a point now where we've reached another extreme, and people will probably unfairly blame capitalism for those extremes, and then potentially engage in a backlash, because lots of people are perhaps more amenable to trying to take from other people what they've earned when they feel like they haven't earned it fairly, and when those people feel like they didn't have a chance. The problem with the system that we have today is it creates degenerates on both sides of the line. It creates degenerates because on the side of rich people, we give more people that have made money that maybe didn't deserve it as much, or got more money than they deserved. And then you get a lot of really people that haven't made much money, but now feel somehow entitled to a story of victimhood around why they haven't accumulated money. And they can very easily blame the people that have spent their lives accumulating or working hard. It is what it is. This is what happens when you get to these extremes,
Yeah, and when you think about these extremes and the iniquities that you just referenced, or what do you think? Maybe two different questions. What would you do if you were in charge of this system to fix those? Or how do you? Another way to answer the question is, how do you think they're going to be resolved politically?
That's very difficult. I don't know. I mean, one way they could be resolved is that we have a series of catastrophic foreign engagements that maybe even come home in the form of attacks against our infrastructure or physical attacks. I don't know. I mean, things that basically destroy wealth and also provide a sort of common cause impetus to make common sacrifices, and there's some kind of reset. I'm describing something akin to a war. We got a strong middle class after World War II. Not that that's a desirable outcome. It's interesting because it's not like the cool people and the sort of the people who seem to be resonating with the disaffected masses in the country are Republicans, not Democrats. And so far, it's the Democratic populists like Bernie Sanders who are more prone to making arguments about raising taxes and, all that stuff. And it's also problematic because it's not like I pay 50% of my income in taxes between federal, state, and local. That's crazy. How much do I need to pay? How much more do I need to pay in taxes is that really the problem? That, I'm sure there are people that make much more than me that evade taxes, but that's not really what we're talking about. When guys like Bernie Sanders want to raise taxes 70% or 80%, I think he had said 70. They made the argument that Dwight D. Eisenhower under Dwight, we had 90% for income earners. That's also misleading because Warren Buffett doesn't make most of his money in personal income. It's only a fraction of that, which is why he can say that his secretary pays more taxes than he does, because he's probably not taking a salary of any significant amount. I don't know how he gets taxed, but capital gains tax at the time that he said that was, I don't know, but it was as low as 15% for Donald Trump. So I think I'm meandering now. I definitely don't think that capital should be capital should be taxed less than income. So right now, for example, if you're working and you're making a certain amount of money, you're already paying more in taxes than people that have had their capital locked up for a year and take profits. Now that's problematic. That's an example of prioritizing capital over labor. But the truth is, I'm not really someone that's best equipped. I'm just a complex issue, and I'm not really the best person to ask about kind of how it's going to play out or what should be done. I think more importantly, I think I'm much more focused on the sort of foreign policy issues when it comes to politics, and less so on domestic redistribution questions and policy.
Yeah, so why don't we end by talking about that a little bit? I know that there's big geopolitical issues kind of beginning or midway through. We've got war in Ukraine. We've got this sort of pivot away from China. What's your take on America's position And what should America do in the face of these changes?
Well, I just recorded an episode today about this. It's difficult. I'm a believer. I am someone who believes in the necessity of American power in the world we live in today as a means by which to preserve the imperfect rules-based liberal order that we have today. Because why would a Chinese system not be worse? It would be, presumably. I mean, so I feel like my view is that like I want to support the United States and the United States military to maintain that order. The question is, to what degree are we contributing to the chaos? For example, like if you're China, if you're the Chinese Communist Party, or if you're Russia, there are reasons that the United States can make you feel insecure. So to what degree, does our presence contribute to the insecure environment that we then live in? But also, like, how prepared are we or able are we to actually defend that order? That's the other danger. Are we actually in a position to deter the Chinese from invading Taiwan? And if we're not, and we stumble into a conflict, that could be pretty catastrophic. I'm a believer in NATO and the important role the United States plays in Europe. I supported the supporting of Ukraine in their resistance against Russia. I don't know where this stuff is going, man. I think the public perception around American power is out of sync with where things actually are. The question is, are China and Russia much weaker than we perceive them to be? Russia was perceived to be stronger than they turned out to be. Are the Chinese weaker than we perceive? Time will tell.
Yeah, and I completely agree with your thesis around the paramount importance of our country in this thing, because look, America, for better or worse, is the last hope. If there's no America, the future of the world is like what the people who fought World War II were afraid of seeing, which is like this totalitarian state, now armed with even more sort of, to use Churchill's phrase, like odious technologies, right? Like it's even scarier. And so America has this obligation to defend the world order. And I'm a huge believer in that thesis. And I think the question you just posed, I think it's an interesting question. It's probably true, which is, yeah, China probably is a lot weaker than we're describing. It's very difficult to, even imagine planning an invasion of Taiwan. Like back in the old days, it took like months and months, and there's only a few people on planet Earth who knew how to like organize these flotillas in a combat scenario. Like China has no experience doing that. So they probably aren't as prepared as people think they are.
We'll see. We could end up seeing, we could test that thesis in the next few years.
What do you think how do you think they respond? I guess it depends who's president.
No, I don't know that it depends who's president. And I don't know, honestly. If I had to guess, I would guess the United States would defend Taiwan. I think there's such a strong institutional support for continued American hegemony. I think that would be the default.
Fascinating. All right, we'll have one final question. Thank you for being so generous with your time. This has been I know it's been a wide-ranging conversation, but you've been talking and researching a lot of different topics, so I wanted to get into it. My last one is a question about citizenship and sort of what your definition of it is, and what in America, how should people be thinking about their obligations of citizenship?
That's a tough one, because also I think everyone has a moral right, in a sense, to view their obligations a bit differently. One, I think your obligations as a citizen, I think, are largely determined by your success in the private sector. And when I say your success, I mean your success in creating the space to devote to civic discourse and thinking about civic problems. Not necessarily how much money you make, but how much free time do you have to allocate. So some people are very busy and don't have that time to allocate to being an informed citizen, and that's understandable. So, but to the extent that you have that time, I think you have a moral obligation to spend some of it informing yourself and trying to, because literally, if you think about it, it's the same thing as like jury duty. No one wants to fucking do jury duty. And I will try to get out of jury duty, to be honest with you. Like I try to get out of it, because who wants to do it? But I have also accepted doing it in the past because of a sense of like, well, if I don't do it, who's going to do it? And I just hope I don't get dragged in being there for months and months. And jury duty is a much like more intense obligation. Being an informed citizen isn't. It just means that you have to devote some of your daily life to actually understanding what's going on and contributing, positively to the discourse and to trying to vote effectively. So I think that's kind of like the first obligation we have. And then I would just say that there's a larger obligation that we have to our fellow citizens, not necessarily as like a citizen in our role as voting and being informed, but I would just say what I don't like to see is a kind of persistent cynicism that a lot of people have and how they see the world and how they see government. And they have a kind of attitude of like, oh, I don't care, it's all bullshit anyway. Let it burn, whatever. But if everyone has that attitude, then it will burn, and really, you're not going to be happy with the outcome. So I just think we have an obligation to ourselves and to others to be constructive in how we deal with the issues that affect our lives, and that in a democracy there is no one else. It's up to us. So that's what I would basically say.
It's a great answer. Completely agree with both of those points. Well, Demetri, thank you for taking the time to come on the show. I'll make sure to include links out to Hidden Forces podcast, but is there anything else you want the readers to know about where to find you?
No, you can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas. You can learn more about the show at hiddenforces.io.
Thanks for coming on the show, Demetri.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for listening to the Nick Halaris Show. We hope you enjoyed the episode and would appreciate your help with spreading the word by sharing with your network on social. And until next time, remember, it's not about pursuing success to unlock fulfillment. It's about learning how to find fulfillment in the midst of success.